Welcome and thank you for joining us for this online conversation about an exciting is not the right word, it's just an incredible piece of art in Rachmaninoff's Vespers, commonly known as the Vespers, also known as the All-Night Vigil. I'm joined by Welz Kauffman, our managing director, who's actually brought some fun props today. To talk about this incredible piece with which I've had a number of experiences. I remember singing Bogorodice Dievo, which I think is your favorite movement.
It is.
When I was
I can't
in high school.
it, but it is.
Okay.
I call it number 6.
Okay. When I was in high school, and then I've conducted excerpts of this piece over the years. True Concord performed the work back in 2012, so I can't believe it. It's been 11 years. Of course, my kid is 11 years old, so that's a marker for me. Where have those 11 years gone? Just a moving, incredible piece of music that I get the opportunity, we at True Concord get the opportunity to do again and to present to you. And so we want to talk about that. I do have to admit, I'm still sort of floating high from Haydn creation.
As well you should be.
I was telling, there were so many people that came to me and said they hadn't heard that piece. And that was a stunning revelation to me. Because to me, it's one of the best pieces out there. But one of my comments is it's hard to live in the shadow of Mozart.
It is.
And Haydn isn't up there in the top 3 or 5 in people's minds. They think of Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart and Bach, but this piece, pretty special, and our audiences seem to really love it.
Well, Haydn's also hard, and not that Mozart and Beethoven and Brahms are easy, but Haydn is deceptively difficult. One of the reasons why, for instance, Esa-Pekka Salonen in Los Angeles and Leonard Bernstein in New York, when they took over those orchestras, they did Haydn surveys because it was a way to not perfect the orchestra, but to kind of perfect the orchestra, but also kind of take its temperature, where it was musically, where it was technically, especially the strings, but also, as we know from the creation, the winds and the brass, and especially the flute, that amazing flute playing. We're so blessed at True Concord to have those Tucson Symphony principals and other players to join us for a piece like that, because it's not something that one tosses off, nor is the Messiah, but the Messiah, you can get away with it because everybody sings along.
Well, there's that.
Even the solos they sing along with. So yes, of course, Hallelujah Chorus, but they know For Us a Child is Born. They know all of those things because of Peanuts.
Well, I haven't made that connection.
There are no those cultural. There's no Amadeus for Haydn, right?
That's right.
He wrote 100 and gajillion symphonies and
right.
a whole bunch of string quartets, and he created the piano sonata as we know it today. He taught Beethoven, he taught Mozart. But it's one of those composers, and the creation is one of those pieces that a lot of people say, well, of course I heard it, I've heard it, I've listened to recordings. But in fact, they just think they have. And I'm not being dismissive of what they think, they just think they have. I think there's a whole wealth of discovery around Haydn still to be done. And then for a long time, Haydn was dissed in the musicological world. Mozart, great, Haydn, not so great, right? And that recovery happened largely because of pieces like The Creation and the other big vocal works with John Elliott Gardner and Robert Shaw, right? The either end of the kind of vocal ensemble spectrum in terms of performance practice and what does it mean to be legit to the time of when Haydn wrote The Creation and where we are in the world today, which that's what Shaw was always talking about. We're talking a lot about The Creation. I think we're supposed to be talking about
we are supposed to be talking about Rachmaninoff, yes.
But Rachmaninoff, like Horowitz, and like a lot of the great Russian pianists, played Clementi and Haydn.
Great etudes.
So hey, we just connected.
Good.
Well, when are we doing the Rachmaninoff? March
24, 25, and 26.
Right.
So thank you to all of you who joined us for that
Yes.
special work in Haydn creation. 3 rousing ovations for it. And we close our season in fitting style, I think, for the a cappella tour de force composition in this Vespers piece. I was thinking the other day of other pieces that could possibly be in the category in terms of its sophistication, its complexity, its spirituality, and its length at about 60 minutes. And it's hard to come up with a list. I thought of, the Martin double choir mass, the Vaughan Williams mass in G minor, but they're like 30 minutes. This is 60 minutes of a cappella singing at its most sophisticated and at a deeply spiritual level. Spiritual for Rachmaninoff, who wasn't necessarily a churchgoer, but it is so imbued with this profundity of spirituality. I don't know how else to put it.
It's I'm afraid we'll never really know a very complicated life, Rachmaninoff. A very tragic life, one with a lot of fear, escaping the Soviet Union with his wife and 2 young daughters, one of which families came to America earlier than the other, and many of whom settled in the Tucson and Texas and Illinois areas and Central America. Interesting American connection that way. But I think the significance of that and the escape where he lost everything. He left all of his money, he left all of his music, he left his cars, he left his house. He had already become the Rachmaninoff that we think of today as the greatest living pianist, maybe the greatest pianist that ever lived. But he had to leave that all behind and create a life anew. And that's why America was so important to him.
Yeah.
For him, America always meant freedom. It also meant a career and a life of being able to tour the country on trains and to live in New York and to live in Beverly Hills, where these huge 150th anniversary birthday celebrations are going on, along with Lucerne, where he built a home. This is the home, Sinar. Many of you listening may know that Russians were fond of naming their homes. And what they would do was take the first letters of the husband's name and first letters of the wife's name and the last of the last name. So this is Sinar, Serge and Natalie Rachmaninoff.
Cool.
For those that have been to Tanglewood, the sort of donor dinner place is Saranac, Serge and Natalie Kusevitsky. Same sort of thing. This is a Bauhaus designed house in 1930 that the denizens of Lake Lucerne, who had little curly Q, cuckoo clock kind of houses, which are wonderful, were shocked by. He designed it himself with a friend who was a German architect. The house is still there. I'm on the Rachmaninoff Foundation, which is based at the house. Mm-hmm. It's quite extraordinary. His studio, where he wrote most of his late works, is right there. Dining room, bedrooms upstairs, beautiful property, a convent across the street, very quiet, and the lake is over here with his own boathouse, the last private boathouse built on Lake Lucerne. A place of contemplative spirituality. You were talking about spirituality, and even though the Vespers was written long before this was the kind of place where he felt that, along with, as a young man, he and his parents often lived close to places, close to churches. And so bells always had a huge significance for him. Of course, the great oratorio, the bells, but also the Vespers and the piano works. There are indications and hints of bells throughout.
That's really cool. Thank you for sharing this. You also brought this along, Welz, and tell us about this.
Rachmaninoff, as I mentioned, had 2 daughters, and one had family that settled in America pretty quickly. The other, the Konis family, in Europe and then in New York. Alexander Konis, who changed his name to Alexander Rachmaninoff, grandson of Sergei, I met in 2001, and we became very close friends. He looked a lot like his grandfather, kind of spookily so. And he told me a lot of great stories. and gave me a lot of great gifts, including this beautiful book, which is a book of architecture all around Lake Lucerne. Excuse me, and this, which is not an original score, but this is a score of the Vespers. A lot of blank pages in the front, in Russian, including his name, Sergei Rachmaninoff, in Cyrillic, and T. Conus, so that was the father of Alexander, who I knew. This is the sixth movement that Eric already indicated was a favorite of mine, and has been used a great deal recently as a protest song for Ukrainians. And I think one of the things that, as we live through this terrible time, excuse me, is that Sergei loved Kyiv. This is why when Eric and I were designing last year's brochure, the Kyiv Cathedral is on the cover, not St. Basil's at the Kremlin, not because Sergei disavowed everything Russian, but he did disavow a lot Russian.
Oh, yeah.
But he kept the Ukrainian as a cultural and musical capital. It's also where he met his great friend, the great bass, Shaliapin. Shaliapin, if you can imagine, Thomas Kwastoff, Tom Hampson, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, Jose Van Damme, all in one person. That was Shaliapin. And Rachmaninoff wrote the Vespers thinking of Shaliapin and that low bass.
Low bass.
And he also wrote several of his operas for Shaliapin, which were premiered at the Ukrainian Opera House in Kyiv. So a big connection there.
So this was gifted to you.
Yes. Actually, I kind of stole it. And then I by mistake, and I was staying at a hotel near Sinar on the lake, and I came back and I gave it back to Alexander, and he said, no, please keep it. So again, not original. What's interesting about the original scores and all the manuscripts is that after Sergei Rachmaninoff passed away, his wife gave all of that to the Library of Congress. And the important part of that was not just that she knew it would be safe and well preserved, and it is.
Yeah.
It's because he and she were so grateful to FDR for being the president of the United States, keeping America strong in World War II, and to Americans in general, and they wanted everything to go there. Now, the kids were not happy to see all of those go because of the value of these is so huge. But you can go see them, you can't check them out, but you can see them on microfilm. There are all sorts of reasons why it was the right reason, but for them it was a reason of patriotism, and they consider themselves Americans in many ways. They would often, when asked about nationality, he would say, I'm a musician of the world. Then they'd drill down a little bit and he'd say, I'm an American.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. And this is obviously very special. You mentioned this is in Cyrillic, and I often get the question of, so what language will we be singing this work in? And it's not Russian, it's Slavonic, it's a church Slavonic that is central to the Orthodox tradition, which is not just in Russian Orthodox, but Ukraine and over much of Eastern Europe. So it's
Greek Orthodox as well.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so it is a universal language for that tradition, and it poses its own sort of challenges for us because we don't sing in this language very often. Although I will say that we've got a little bit of practice in it because, as I mentioned, we have performed this work back in 2012. We also have performed Rachmaninoff's St. John Chrysostom, which is his other really great
masterpiece,
a cappella masterpiece. Real close to the Rachmaninoff in terms of its just uniqueness and specialness. I also get questions about, is it Vespers or is it All Night Vigil? Which is it? And this piece wasn't necessarily designed for a liturgical experience.
It's a concert piece.
It is a concert piece. And it combines several of the canonical hours, including Vespers, Matins, and Prime, those texts that form the basis of those particular services. Vespers is just one of them. So I think colloquially we've sort of grabbed onto the Vespers as a title for it, but it's really the all-night vigil, and it is what it is in terms of that all-night descriptive language. It starts with Vespers, which is an evening service. It goes into those canonical hours that take place all through the night, including to the first hour prime when you get the first sunrise of the day. So I'm thinking about Rachmaninoff being in a place like this. As you said, you didn't write this work in that environment. I can imagine him thinking about going from dusk to dawn and all of the imagery that comes with that, and it's in this music.
Yeah. He also, interestingly about Lake Lucerne, and maybe some of the folks watching this conversation and listening know this, but Lake Lucerne is a very famous musical lake. It's actually not a lake, it's just a very wide river. And Alexander Rachmaninoff would say that to me, "Oh, not a lake." Wagner, the house where he wrote his Siegfriedel, which he wrote for Cosima, Liszt's daughter, who he had an adulterous relationship with and then married. When she had a child, she was coming downstairs at the house, which is across the lake on Lake Lucerne from Sennar, and there was a string ensemble playing the Siegfriedel. Brahms went to Lake Lucerne to write the William Tell Overture. The opera William Tell is based at Lake Lucerne. There are Strauss, Mahler, Liszt. I mean, everybody went there, like a lot of them went to Lake Como in Italy, not too far away, for inspiration, for hiking, beautiful, beautiful mountains. And that's why it's one of the major cities in the world celebrating Rachmaninoff. I think one of the things about the Vespers that I've always found interesting, but I can't say I really knew, and I have slaughtered and embarrassed myself playing Rachmaninoff pieces all my life. It's impossible music to play, and yes, technically it's fiendish, but musically it seems kind of like Haydn, so simple, like, oh, it's tunes, right? You're often told by your teacher, use more singing tone, which I think is a clue about his relationship with Chelyabin and his feeling about vocal music, and his desire to have been known as not a piano concerto writer, but as an opera composer. In the same way that Dvorak wanted to be known as an opera composer, and many other composers. Part of that is financial, because if you are an opera composer and it gets played at an opera house, you get royalties every time it's done. So we know that part of it, but it's the singing part of it. Rachmaninoff was often ridiculed and thought of as being kind of cheap, especially with the advent of Hollywood, and people would call his music movie music. And he would often say, well, what if there weren't any movies? Then what they would call it. Good answer. But he's being celebrated in Los Angeles in a big way, because the realization of the greatness of the music, yes, how it's constructed structurally, yes, how it has expanded what a pianist can do. It was the Vespers that was the serious piece that would make him known in a completely different way, which is why it didn't get to be as well known as quickly as the big virtuosic piano pieces, or the Second Symphony, or the symphonic dances, which is one of the first uses of saxophone in an orchestra.
Right.
I mean, all these interesting things and places that he was going. This is his 150th birthday year. He would have been, I think, 70, so he died young, very, very tall. He had the same malady that Lincoln had, very long face. I can't remember what that's called. But he never cared what critics thought at all. He did want to make money and support his family, and crisscrossed the country all the time on trains, which is why Chicago got so many performances from Rachmaninoff, because he kept stopping there on the way between LA and New York. And there is a famous and true story that he stopped on the way from Chicago to LA, and the train stopped to let passengers off or do whatever in Tucson.
Right.
And he got off to smoke a cigarette, and the train left. And it didn't bother him, because he thought he was in Los Angeles. So he walked into what we think must have been the Hotel Congress.
Right.
And walked up to a woman and said, "I'm Sergei Rachmaninoff," and she almost fainted. He was so famous. This is 1925. And he said, I missed my train, or whatever he said. I would like to play a recital tonight. So she found a high school, or maybe it's
Tucson High
Temple
School,
Music
I think,
of Art,
yeah.
where Arizona Theater Company and the opera do things. And there was a recital there. And the program for it, the one existing paper copy of the program, is in the Arizona Historical Society. So he loved America for the big open spaces. He loved the train ride between Tucson and LA because of the desert, like a lot of Europeans do. Just interesting stories about this great composer. Now, you were talking about the Haydn, which was just a fantastic experience. And one of the great things about True Concord is that the ensemble and Eric perform in venues that are about 300 to 500 seats, right? Yeah. So not 2,000 seats, not 3,000 seats, not even 1,500 seats. There's an intimacy to that, which is going to make this even more powerful. But what I love is at intermission or after a performance, when the cookies come out, people stay and they talk about what they just experienced. So after the Haydn, people were talking about how they had collected live performances of the creation. And that this one that Eric had just done with True Concord stood up there with all these other great luminary ones. Then they moved to, well, the last performances, and a woman looked like she was gonna cry because she didn't want True Concord season to end, would be the Rachmaninoff Vespers. Yeah. And they were saying to each other, maybe they weren't at that previous performance, you know, what does Eric think of Rachmaninoff? Because they just heard one of not just a great piece of music, but a great classical piece of music, right? In terms of capital C classical, the Haydn creation. What would he do with, and how did he feel about Rachmaninoff? And I thought, you know, lurking behind that question is maybe Rachmaninoff is a little cheap. Maybe it's a little not quite, in terms of Russian composers, maybe it's not quite as great as Shostakovich or Prokofiev or Tchaikovsky or Rimsky. Certainly not Bach or Beethoven or Brahms, but in fact it is. And just because it's popular and just because it continues to sell tickets doesn't mean it isn't. It was an interesting dialogue. But back to the question, so what do you think of Rachmaninoff? When you said you sang it in high school or in movement or?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's just something about this music. And you mentioned the Bogorodice Dievo here, it's open to it. This was my first encounter with it. It just taps into something really deep, and it transcends religion. It's something deeper than that, and I think that's why people gravitate toward it, because it's got a universality to it, a depth to it. I wouldn't use the word cheap whatsoever. This is among the finest choral music we have, I think, for pure voices. And we just did the Haydn, we keep coming back to the Haydn, which is a grand work for choir, orchestra, and soloists. This is all about the choir. This is, you know, the first instrument. So that makes it unique, it makes it special. It really resonates, and when I say resonate, it's physically and then some. I mean, we talked about the basso profundo component to it. It just kind of almost makes your chest rattle.
Yes,
it's
like bagpipes or an accordion or something that you have on your chest, or a euphonium perhaps that you have on your body,
right,
where you're actually feeling the vibration. It's a different sort of thing.
You know, and it obviously resonated with Rachmaninoff too, because
Definitely.
he referred to this as one of his greatest achievements. He requested that a portion of it be sung at his funeral. So very special to him as well. And I know for our audiences in our previous performance of it and the St. John Chrysostom, they just walk away, just feel like they've had an experience, you know, a transcendental experience. And that's the power of music, and that's the power of music making, and the power of True Concord in the sense of bringing people together, which is what True Concord is all about. Music has that power. This music has that power to do that. And I think it's fitting that we do it on this 150th anniversary of Rachmaninoff's birth. I think it's fitting we close our season with it. You mentioned how special Kiev is. was to Rachmaninoff. There is Kiev in this. There's chant that originates from Kiev in this work. It seems so timely at this time, especially we're going into the second year of this terrible conflict, that we do this music that was so near and dear to Rachmaninoff's heart.
Absolutely right. I think it's going to be the kind of thing that if someone comes on Saturday night, they're going to want to come on Sunday again.
Yeah.
It's one of those.
Yep.
Like a Bruce Springsteen concert, having been to 6 of those in a row back in the 80s. Totally different online conversation.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that at this time, this piece is being done. I'm very much looking forward to these performances. I think the Sunday is pretty well sold at Catalina Foothills.
Yeah.
But Saturday, there's still some
Yeah,
availability.
we still have availability on
And then
Saturday.
On Friday.
Yeah,
as
so
well.
get your tickets at trueconcord.org or call our office at 520-401-2651. Also,
Speaking
special.
of basso profundos and baritones, yes, please, go for it.
Also, we should point out that our very own Edward Vogel and Marc Laster at the piano will be presenting a wonderful program of all British music, taking place at the inner courtyard of the Hacienda del Sol, which is a
Beautiful patio.
really cool
Yeah.
place. Corinne Winters performed a recital there during our bubble season. It was music under the stars with, a gin and tonic or a glass of wine. Really beautiful evening. So that is Monday, the 27th at 6 p.m. But I think we all should say that on this week of these concerts, we are going to be unveiling our 20th anniversary season.
Can you believe it's your 20th anniversary?
I can't believe it.
I bet you can. Yeah.
Again, where did all those years go?
Right.
But I'm so grateful to all of you and the community here in Tucson that have propelled us to this 20th anniversary milestone, and we have got just a doozy of a season. And we're going to share it with you and the world starting that week of March 19th.
We're dropping the brochure that week.
Yes,
right? And
so-
there'll be newspaper inserts and
Yes.
all sorts of good stuff.
We'll have our brand new brochure
Right.
at the concerts with all the details. And can we tell them about reserved seating yet? Or?
Absolutely. We've been telling all the audiences every
I'll
night
let
for
you
the
do
last
it.
year. I've worked in arts administration for a long time, probably too long. I should go back to Baskin-Robbins, which was my original profession, and Paperboy. One of the things that became au courant within the arts administration world, and in the world in general, were focus groups and questionnaires. I think we found, especially during COVID, where people were cooped up or locked up, that those things, Zoom, focus groups, and questionnaires became huge, long, very detailed. People got very tired of them, even a little bit angry. So we've been listening to our audiences over the years. And when I say we, I mean our tremendous volunteer corps, who are ushers, I mean the staff, I mean Eric, I mean the singers, I mean the instrumentalists who go out there and join for a cookie, and we're going to be doing more of that now that COVID is, thank God, lifting, and they can do that safely. One of the things we have continually heard, two things. One is, could we have perhaps earlier start times?
Yep.
People love the matinee on Sunday at Catalina Foothills at 3 o'clock. Is there a way of adjusting start times? We had really good discussions internally and compared some of that data that we received. And we will have some earlier start times in Green Valley, especially if people really wanted a matinee on a Friday, which people say, why would you have a matinee on a weekday? Well, actually, the matinee, which actually means a morning concert, typically is 11 a.m., in the Midwest, those were coffee concerts and fashion show concerts for orchestras for years. So it was a very common thing that you would do a Thursday night and then a coffee concert, or 11 o'clock or at 2 o'clock on a Friday, and that still continues to happen. So we're going to be doing 3 o'clock in Green Valley, which means people can have supper afterwards. I always accentuate that because just like the lobby at Catalina Foothills, where people discuss what they just heard, people like to sit, have a meal, have a drink, and talk to their friends about what they just experienced, or talk to strangers about what they just experienced, which is really fantastic. So that's going to happen. The other big piece is that for those of our audience who know our seating situation very well, there are some seats which are blanked out and reserved, and our volunteer, I don't know how they do it. It's an incredible effort and works really well so that people can sit a little bit closer or a little more center or whatever it might be. With the rest of the seating being what we call GA, general admission, everything will be reserved next year. So we are going to do what I think is not only the right thing, but the really fun thing, and contact our ticket buyers and let them know we're here to answer their questions about programs, about reserved seating, about earlier start times, about cookies, about individual members of the vocal ensemble, about why doesn't Eric do Rachmaninoff Vespers every year, all of those kinds of things. It's a way of getting a more meaningful focus group in many ways, or from something like a questionnaire where people will just often check off things just to get rid of it from their computer. Sometimes those things work. This is much more effective, and it was out of those sources that we have decided to go this route with reserved seating. We'll finish our season on March 27 with Ned's recital, last ensemble performance the 26th, and then we will start those calls, and we have time to do that. The first concerts that you've programmed for 23-24, the 20th anniversary, are in the middle of October.
Right. So
there are probably going to be some bumps along the way and people confused about why this is happening, and that's why we want to have voice-to-voice conversations.
That's right.
Because it's what you all wanted.
Yep, you spoke and we listened, and so we're thrilled.
And we like it. I mean,
Yes.
it's good. It's not just that you wanted it and we're doing it out of, it's not that we don't want to do it. It's great.
That's right, and so lots of exciting things on tap for this special year, and can't wait to tell you more about it. But in the meantime, we sincerely hope that you enjoy Rachmaninoff's Vespers or All Night Vigil, and we look forward to seeing all of you there. And we and all of us at True Concord want to say thank you very, very much for making this 19th season wildly successful, very meaningful, and we wish you all the best in the summer months ahead.
Thank you all.